The night sky over the Caribbean looked calm, too calm for a region on the edge of rupture. Radars scanned empty horizons, but commanders whispered the question no one dared say aloud. What happens if Nicolas Maduro pushes 1 inch further? The answer for the first time in years was unclear, because now the United States had drawn a new line, one backed not by quiet diplomacy, but by the unmistakable message of a president who declared that America was ready to do it the hard way if needed. The Caribbean had become a stage of unanswered questions, unpredictable moves, and the growing realization that a single miscalculation could drag the hemisphere into its most dangerous confrontation in decades. And as the world watched one reality emerged, the crisis no longer revolved around what Maduro would do next, but how far Washington was willing to go to stop him. The escalation did not come from a sudden military strike or a bold provocation. It began quietly with a negotiation that was never fully a negotiation. President Donald Trump publicly acknowledged that his administration had opened channels to Maduro, entertaining the possibility of dialogue to ease the humanitarian catastrophe bleeding across Venezuela's borders. Yet even in extending that diplomatic hand, he issued a message of unmistakable severity. The United States preferred the easy way, but was entirely prepared for the difficult one. The phrase landed across Latin America like a warning shot reverberating through defense ministries and intelligence briefings. Washington's strategy had shifted. Instead of isolating Caracas solely through sanctions, the US began constructing a multi-layered security barrier, naval patrols, intelligence sharing networks, and rapid response capabilities stretching from Florida to Panama. These actions were not merely symbolic, they were a direct response to narco-trafficking vessels linked to Venezuelan networks, dozens of which had been intercepted or destroyed since September. Each engagement was a message the era of permissive tolerance toward criminal routes tied to state actors had ended. But the real turning point came when the Dominican Republic authorized limited US use of parts of its military infrastructure. The decision was not routine. It marked a political commitment that reshaped regional alignments. From San Isidro Air Base to the Las Americas International Airport, Washington gained logistical depth, refueling access equipment, transit, and rapid air deployment routes that placed pressure directly on Venezuela's northern flank. For the first time, the Caribbean began to function as a unified security perimeter, a coordinated ring designed to disrupt narcotics corridors and contain destabilizing influence. Regional governments understood what the move signaled: the hemisphere would no longer tolerate Venezuela's transformation into a launchpad for criminal networks or geopolitical manipulation. Dominican President Luis Abinader, standing beside US officials, did not frame the agreement as symbolic cooperation, but as an urgent defense measure, an operational barrier against transnational crime, and a reinforcement of hemispheric security. In the shadows, intelligence agencies noted increases in Venezuelan military readiness, raising questions about Maduro's next move. Amid this tightening ring, one fact became clear: the crisis had entered a new phase. Dialogue and deterrence now existed side by side, each capable of collapsing into confrontation with a single strategic miscalculation. And at the center of it stood a question that neither Washington nor Caracas had yet answered: how far would each side go when the easy path finally closed? The Caribbean crisis took on a sharper edge the moment the Dominican Republic broke its long tradition of cautious neutrality. In an announcement that reverberated across the hemisphere, President Luis Abinader authorized the United States to use portions of the San Isidro Air Base and the Las Americas International Airport for refueling, equipment transfers, and technical support. What seemed at first like a logistical courtesy quickly revealed itself as something far more consequential. The Caribbean's balance of power had shifted, and Washington now possessed a forward operating platform poised just a short flight from Venezuelan airspace. This move did not emerge from political theatrics or diplomatic pressure. It came from cold operational necessity. For months, narco-trafficking vessels moving through the Caribbean and Pacific had been attacked or destroyed by US forces, underscoring a dramatic surge in regional criminal activity tied to Venezuelan networks. Since September alone, dozens of suspicious boats had been intercepted, many linked to syndicates operating under the blind eye or tacit protection of the Maduro regime. The Dominican government, confronted with credible intelligence that these trafficking routes were evolving into militarized corridors, recognized that the threat was no longer abstract. It was immediate, corrosive, and woven into the same regional instability that kept migrants fleeing by the millions. Standing beside the US Secretary of War Abinader articulated the goal with striking clarity: reinforce the aerial and maritime security ring that shields the Caribbean from narcotics penetration and organized crime. It was not merely a policy statement, it was a declaration that the region intended to stand with Washington against against the destabilizing influence emanating from Caracas. The base access agreement became a visible symbol of hemispheric alignment, and its message to Maduro could not have been clearer. The neighbors were closing ranks. From a strategic standpoint, the implications were profound. San Isidro offers direct access to the Northern Caribbean Air Corridor, one of the most important aviation routes for surveillance, early warning drones, maritime patrol aircraft, and rapid response jets. The Las Americas Airport, meanwhile, allows for seamless logistical integration, enabling the U.S. to rotate personnel, move humanitarian aid, and rapidly deploy assets in a crisis. Taken together, these facilities created a de facto staging network that expanded Washington's operational reach without requiring permanent troop presence. For the U.S. military planners operating in the era of President Donald Trump, this cooperation fit perfectly into a doctrine emphasizing agile distributed basing over large fixed deployments. Flexibility and speed replaced footprint, and the Caribbean, long treated as a quiet periphery, had suddenly become a strategic front line. Maduro, however, interpreted the Dominican authorization as an encirclement maneuver. Venezuelan state media framed the development as an American attempt to corner the Bolivarian Revolution, and senior officials accused Washington of preparing a regional pincer through which an eventual intervention could be launched. Whether this reflected sincere fear or deliberate propaganda, the effect was the same. Caracas heightened its readiness level, accelerated militia mobilization, and intensified anti-American messaging. Yet the regional perspective told a very different story. To governments across the Caribbean and Central America, Venezuela's crisis had become a humanitarian catastrophe with hemispheric consequences. Millions of migrants strained public services. Criminal networks used weakened Venezuelan institutions as safe havens. The risk of state failure, real or perceived, made cooperation with the U.S. not optional but essential. Thus, the Dominican decision represented more than military access. It was a declaration of collective responsibility. The region would not wait for Caracas to implode before acting. And with Washington now positioned at the doorstep of Venezuela's maritime frontier, the confrontation had entered a phase where diplomacy, deterrence, and force projection existed in a single fragile equilibrium. Maduro's determination to remain in power, even as Venezuela fractures under economic collapse and international pressure, stems from something deeper than mere ambition. It is survival instinct, political, judicial, and personal. For Nicolas Maduro, exile is not a refuge. It is a death sentence, disguised as sanctuary. The era when dictators could flee to European villas and spend the rest of their years sipping wine along the Riviera has ended. The world he inhabits now is one of extradition treaties, international tribunals, and forensic financial tracking. Every route outward leads to a courtroom, a prison, or the loss of the wealth he accumulated through a decade of authoritarian rule. And so rather than surrender, he digs in, convinced that staying in Caracas is his only path to safety. Security advisors close to the Venezuelan leader whisper the same message into his ear: the United States is bluffing. According to them, Washington does not possess the political will to stage a ground invasion, and any attempt to project force beyond targeted strikes would drag the U.S. into a costly urban conflict. Maduro believes this narrative. To him, President Donald Trump's warnings reflect pressure tactics, not a roadmap toward intervention. As long as American boots do not land on Venezuelan soil, he sees no scenario in which he is forcibly removed. This belief reinforces Maduro's decision to reject every offer of a negotiated exit. International emissaries have repeatedly floated proposals of safe passage to Cuba or a sympathetic allied state. Each time Maduro declined, not because he saw victory on the horizon, but because every path of exile led into the unknown, a gap where promises could break, alliances could shift, and the new Venezuelan government could pursue him relentlessly. In his view, only the Venezuelan military, its loyal core of officers groomed over years of purges, favors, and ideological indoctrination, offers him true protection. If he leaves, that circle dissolves. If he stays, it shields him. Maduro's calculus is shaped by his understanding of dictators who fell before him. Some fled and were hunted. Others stayed and fought until they carved a negotiated transition from the military landscape. Maduro imagines himself in the second category. He is convinced he can survive as long as he projects strength, suppresses dissent, and prevents fractures within the armed forces. The moment he shows weakness, he believes the internal knives come out. This logic has fueled his escalation at home, harsher repression, expanded surveillance, and a political culture of total loyalty where silence equals treason. Human rights organizations report increased detentions and intimidation campaigns, targeting journalists, activists, and political opponents. Fear has become state policy. And still, Maduro does not relent, because fear serves him too. Fear of retaliation, fear of losing protections, fear of the chaotic future that would follow his departure. Meanwhile, Venezuela spirals further into humanitarian catastrophe. Infrastructure collapses, services fail, millions flee. The international community debates options, but the root of the crisis remains unchanging. Maduro will not leave because he believes the world beyond Caracas offers no escape, only consequences. Thus, the impasse deepens not because diplomacy has failed, but because Maduro's safest choice is to continue ruling a nation that no longer wants him. The atmosphere in Caracas shifted abruptly once Washington tightened its diplomatic and military posture. Maduro moved quickly, orchestrating a display of unity designed to project invincibility at home and defiance abroad. He gathered supporters for a mass demonstration, stepping onto the stage dressed in military uniform, flanked by generals whose loyalty had been secured through years of patronage and purges. In front of the crowd, he lifted the sword of Simón Bolívar, a sacred symbol in Chavista mythology, and declared that Venezuela stood ready to resist the aggression of the empire. The gesture was theatrical, deliberately cinematic, but also revealing Maduro was no longer speaking as a politician. He was speaking as a besieged commander, preparing his nation for confrontation. Failure is not an option, he proclaimed, turning his rallying cry into a demand for unconditional loyalty. The audience, made of soldiers, public servants, police, and party loyalists, responded in rehearsed unison. But beneath the surface of choreographed enthusiasm lay a grim reality. The regime was tightening the screws. Human rights groups documented a rise in detentions, intimidation of civil society, and systematic removal of dissenting figures from public life. The message was unmistakable: unity was no longer voluntary. It was mandatory. As internal repression intensified, Maduro launched a propaganda counteroffensive aimed at the international community. A video appeared on his social media accounts showing him casually driving through Caracas alongside Dominican politician Miguel Mejia, nicknamed Miguelon. They passed a metro station, pointed out landmarks, and joked about the supposed normalcy of daily life in the capital. Reuters later verified the location seen in the video, but could not confirm the exact filming date. Verification hardly mattered. The intention was unmistakable. Maduro wanted to create the illusion of a functioning, stable city untouched by crisis. But the reality contradicted the narrative. Airlines had begun suspending flights to Venezuela after U.S. aviation authorities issued warnings about deteriorating conditions. The economy remained in freefall, public services were crumbling, food and medicine shortages persisted. The so-called normalcy displayed in Maduro's video clashed with the fact that more than 7.2 million Venezuelans had fled the country, one of the largest mass displacements in modern history. Polls showed that only 20% of the population still supported the regime. 80% rejected it outright. Yet Maduro continued his theatrical displays, surrounding himself with troops and invoking nationalist myths to mask the state's fragility. His rhetoric became increasingly apocalyptic. The regime's survival, he claimed, was synonymous with the survival of the republic. Any threat to his rule was recast as a threat to the Venezuelan nation itself. This is the psychological armor of authoritarian leaders. Under pressure, blur the line between self-preservation and patriotism, and convince followers that losing the leader means losing the country. Inside military compounds, readiness levels rose. Militia groups allied with Chavismo were mobilized for defensive exercises, though experts widely considered them symbolic forces with limited combat capability. Still, their activation served a political purpose, reinforcing the image of a society preparing for conflict, a nation surrounded and determined to resist. In truth, what Maduro feared most was not an American intervention. It was internal collapse fractures within his own security structure, a loyalty shift that could topple the regime from within. So he performed strength-issued threats, intensified propaganda, and tightened repression, hoping that the display of unity would overshadow Venezuela's unraveling reality. But every performance has limits, and as Washington tightened the regional security ring, the question hanging over Caracas grew heavier. How long can a regime survive on symbolism when the country beneath it is falling apart? As Venezuela descended deeper into its standoff with Washington, another crisis unfolded thousands of miles away, one that revealed a disturbing pattern among modern autocrats. In Eastern Europe, Vladimir Putin made clear that peace in Ukraine would come only on Moscow's terms. His statements echoed the same absolutist logic that guided Maduro negotiations were acceptable only if they cemented gains already seized through force. Putin acknowledged that a US-Ukraine draft proposal discussed in Geneva could serve as a basis for future agreements, but he immediately added the condition that Kyiv must surrender territory. Without such concessions, he warned Russia would simply achieve its objectives militarily. The message was unmistakable: compromise was weakness, and the war would continue until Ukraine bent or broke. This position was more than a diplomatic maneuver. It reflected a worldview in which legitimacy stems from power, not consent. Putin also dismissed the Ukrainian government as illegitimate, suggesting that no binding treaty could be signed with President Volodymyr Zelensky. This rhetorical attack served a strategic purpose. By undermining Kyiv's legitimacy, the Kremlin attempted to weaken Ukraine's negotiating position and pressure Western governments to consider alternative interlocutors, including factions more amenable to Moscow's demands. The pattern mirrored Maduro's tactics: discredit opponents, destabilize institutions, and frame any compromise as a threat to national identity and sovereignty. Washington's posture after Trump's re-election initially hinted at openness to exploring diplomatic avenues, but the Kremlin quickly sought to shape the discussion. Russia floated a 28-point framework that demanded voluntary Ukrainian territorial concessions, reductions in Western military aid, and prohibitions on future deployment of Western troops to Ukraine. These conditions, from Kyiv's perspective, were nothing short of capitulation. They would reward aggression, undermine national sovereignty, and lock Ukraine into permanent vulnerability. When news of these discussions surfaced, bipartisan pressure in Washington forced a recalibration, ensuring that the United States would not endorse any deal that compromised Kyiv's survival. The Venezuelan and Ukrainian crises appeared geographically distant, yet the symmetry was striking. Both Maduro and Putin relied on the same strategy: escalate until negotiations must revolve around their demands, deny opponents legitimacy, and weaponize time. Putin believed Kyiv could be worn down by battlefield attrition and Western fatigue. Maduro believed Washington lacked the will for decisive action. Both calculated that democratic powers bound by legal norms and public accountability would eventually accept frozen conflict rather than open confrontation. Meanwhile, the human cost in both countries continued to rise. Ukraine faced relentless assaults that devastated cities, displaced civilians, and strained its military capacity. Venezuela endured economic collapse, state repression, and the exodus of millions. These crises, though shaped by local context, were connected by a broader global struggle: democracies grappling with regimes that thrive on manufactured chaos. The world observed an uncomfortable truth: the more pressure autocrats faced, the more inflexible they became. Concessions were framed as existential threats. Diplomatic overtures were treated as opportunities to push boundaries. Power, not peace, became the objective. As the US, Europe, and regional allies reassessed their strategies, one question grew sharper: how can democracies deter leaders who view compromise as surrender and conflict as a means of survival? The response from democratic nations to this rising tide of authoritarian brinkmanship revealed a world split between two visions of power. On one side stood regimes like those in Moscow and Caracas, anchored in the belief that sovereignty flows from forced fear and the suppression of dissent. On the other side stood states attempting imperfectly yet persistently to uphold international norms, electoral legitimacy, and the rule of law. As tensions rose across continents, the United States, now under the leadership of President Donald Trump, confronted a geopolitical landscape where diplomacy and deterrence had become inseparable tools. Washington recalibrated its strategy, signaling that while it sought de-escalation, it would not tolerate unilateral territorial demands or authoritarian entrenchment masquerading as national survival. The message to both Putin and Maduro was unmistakable: escalation would not yield legitimacy. Inside, the US bipartisan voices emerged with unexpected force. Senators and defense officials warned against any peace arrangement that undermined Ukraine's sovereignty or emboldened the Kremlin's maximalist ambitions. The United States democratic system, messy, contested, and loud, demonstrated a resilience absent in authoritarian regimes. Where Maduro relied on orchestrated marches and Putin on rigid control of state machinery, Washington's open debate became a strategic asset. It served as a reminder that democracies, possess something autocracies fear: the ability to correct course without collapsing. This flexibility enabled the United States and its allies to reinforce their support for Kiev, reassert commitments to international law, and reject demands that amounted to disguised surrender. Simultaneously, U.S. partners in Latin America reassessed their own stakes. Nations once cautious about aligning too closely with Washington now recognized that Venezuela's instability risked engulfing the entire region. The Dominican Republic's cooperation marked only the beginning. Conversations quietly unfolded across regional capitals on expanding intelligence sharing, maritime patrols, and humanitarian coordination. Countries such as Colombia, Brazil, and Panama weighed how deeply they should integrate into a hemispheric security architecture designed to contain the spread of criminal networks and political extremism. The message was clear: the Western Hemisphere could not afford for Venezuela to become a black hole of governance, crime, and geopolitical manipulation. Meanwhile, Europe faced its own dilemmas. The war in Ukraine had become a defining test of Western endurance. Energy anxieties, political polarization, and economic strain pushed governments to confront a hard truth. The conflict was no longer a regional war, but a global struggle over the rules that govern state behavior. If Russia succeeded in forcing Kiev to concede territory under threat of continued violence, it would set a precedent that could echo from the Caucasus to the South China Sea. The idea that borders can be rewritten by force, that democracies can be coerced into submission, and that authoritarian narratives can shape international agreements challenge the foundation of post-World War II stability. These simultaneous crises underscored a deeper question: what happens when authoritarian regimes coordinate their tactics even indirectly by exploiting democratic restraint? In both Venezuela and Ukraine, time became a weapon. Autocrats banked on exhaustion on the assumption that democracies would eventually prefer flawed peace over costly persistence. Yet the opposite began to unfold. Democracies grew more aware of the stakes. The US hardened its position, European support for Ukraine stabilized, and Latin America recognized that regional security required collective action. Global tensions intensified, but so did the resolve of democratic coalitions. As the world entered an era defined by the clash between coercive power and accountable governance, one truth emerged: freedom demanded vigilance and security required unity. What remained uncertain was whether these coalitions could endure the long contest ahead. And so the central question sharpened, hanging over Caracas, Kiev, Washington, Moscow, and every capital watching the struggle between democracy and authoritarianism unfold. In a world where autocrats wager survival on escalation, how far must democracies go to defend both their principles and their people before the next crisis forces a choice no nation can avoid? The script traces the mounting geopolitical tensions surrounding Venezuela as the United States confronts Nicolás Maduro's authoritarian entrenchment. The crisis escalates when President Donald Trump signals openness to dialogue, but warns he is prepared to do it the hard way, prompting the construction of a regional security ring. The Dominican Republic's decision to grant U.S. forces limited access to its air facilities shifts the strategic balance in the Caribbean, enabling rapid response operations against narco-trafficking networks tied to the Venezuelan regime. Maduro, fearing exile and legal consequences, rejects all offers of safe departure, doubling down on repression and propaganda to maintain internal control. His militarized rallies and staged displays of normalcy contrast sharply with Venezuela's humanitarian collapse. Parallel to this, Vladimir Putin intensifies demands in Ukraine, insisting on territorial concessions and rejecting negotiations with President Zelensky, revealing a broader pattern of authoritarian brinkmanship. The United States and democratic partners respond with increased resolve, rejecting concessions that would undermine sovereignty. As regional and global crises converge, the script highlights a defining struggle: democracies confronting autocrats who perceive compromise as defeat. It ends with an open question on the lengths democracies must go to protect stability in an era of escalating authoritarian ambition.